Transgender men are people who the doctors thought was a woman when they were born, but when they grew up, they could tell people that they're actually a man, and so they transition to be a man.
Daddies, they love each other so proudly. Babas are non-binary, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in.
All right, I pledge my heart. To the rainbow. Of the not so typical gay camp. One camp. Full of pride. Indivisible. With affirmation and equal rights for all.
Our NEA president, Becky Pringle.
We have come here to Florida, our nation's ground zero for shameful, racist, homophobic, misogynistic, xenophobic rhetoric and dangerous actions. In this state where the LGBTQ plus community, especially those who are transgender, face relentless attacks, and you burn with the inner fire of an unbreakable will. No cold can touch your heart. No deluge can dampen your purpose. And yea, you are those stars in the darkness.
So much for bringing this bill forward. And, you know, I, as a parent, really hope the practice of telling our children when they should have sex, which is what abstinence-based sex education is, can stop happening. Because I think it's weird when adults tell children when they should be having sex, no matter when that is.
Voor hun blote lichaam en transgenders. Het gaat echt om het gevoel wat je van binnen hebt.
Wel wat in mijn broek, maar ik ben echt heel blij. Ik werd wakker en ik wist dat...
Het is een soort van dat je vliegt.
Let me introduce you to our non-binary alpaca. The kids voted on a gender-neutral name, Alex, for them. Alex was there to help me during the really quiet moments when nobody would talk during virtual learning. Yes, they were so quiet! But then I also took it as an opportunity to teach my students about how to respect people's pronouns. Did Alex ever get misgendered? Yes. But then it opened up some teachable moments about what to do when that would happen. For example, hey, Mr. Vung, did he just wake up from his nap? Oh, do you mean did they wake up from their nap? Yeah, they just did. I would apologize quickly, make the correction, and move on. I started off modeling how to correct somebody, and then afterwards my students would correct each other whenever somebody would misgender Alex here. Representation in the classroom matters. My kids were 5th graders, and they still got a kick out of Alex. Oh yes, and here's Alex's friend, Lincoln the Llama, who goes by pronouns he, him. At first, my students thought that he had very feminine features, so they thought that he was a girl. And this is why we should never assume somebody's gender just based on what they look like. Alright, Lincoln, say something. Hello. My students were really surprised how low his voice sounded.
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers, it's John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're whole, we're free, and we're winning. Thank you for tuning in on Rumble, on X, and on YouTube. Thank you to the algorithm and our friends at YouTube for suppressing this video here. I know this is not a popular subject. We're actually talking about empowerment, what people can do, and how easy it would actually be to fix certain things. And this is exactly the subject of today's live stream. Welcome everybody in a live chat. Good to see you. So what we were looking at here is, in a nutshell, the current educational system, if you could call it that. It's probably better to call it the indoctrination system or the brainwashing system. And what we feel, at least for me, when I looked at these clips and when I looked at this election, was a level of insanity and madness. And the easy reaction is to pass judgment on these people. Of course, that's the easy reaction, to say they're all mad, they're insane. But chances are that the story goes deeper. There's a reason why these people are the way they are, why they say the things that they say, why they feel the way that they do. And it's probably the same reason that millions of children growing up are listening to them today. If you understand how this system operates, if you understand how we got to this point, and this is why we talk about these things, you also begin to comprehend how easy it is to actually change things. We posted a few quotes here, if you saw that in the clip, and we posted quotes from people that were considered extremely bad, historically speaking, and people that are considered extremely good, if you will, historically speaking, but they all came to the same conclusion. They all concluded that if you get to spend a lot of time with a child from the age of 0 to 7, they studied children, they studied the psyche, they studied the subconscious, and they saw that if you get that time, and if you are a significant influence on a child during that time, you are molding the person that will grow up literally. And for the most part, that's who you're going to get. And so the system, if you will, the educational system was pushed in that direction. Not just the educational system, but society at large was pushed in a direction where, all the secondary education is one thing. Sure, you want to make sure that you see this thing through middle school, high school, and college and university. So you continue the brainwashing, but really the most important thing is 0 to 7. And how this started, it was very difficult. It was very difficult back in the day, outside of church, outside of religion, outside of those arenas, to really have significant influence on people, because most people back in the day weren't, quote unquote, as educated, if you will, or didn't have access to as much literature as you will, if you will. And also, public education wasn't really a thing, and people didn't have standardized schooling and standardized education, and especially not government provided education. So you had a much more difficult time to penetrate the psyche. So what they started doing once they realized that is influence society. So first, the fabric of the family would start falling apart a little bit. And of course, we're going to go into territory here where we find things that were good that happened during that period and things that were very bad. But it was all done in a deceptive manner. The empowerment, the quote unquote empowerment of women, the feminist movement, if you will, it produced some, or let's say the byproduct, some of those byproducts were, of course, those were important. But the idea was really to lead parents and families away from the importance of raising children. So more and more it became important, and that's what certain foundations and certain policies and campaigns in politics, in entertainment, in literature, in education were doing. They were telling people that your career and your, if you will, egotistic desires are more important than the raising of children. And this is, I don't want to point fingers or blame anyone. This was subtle and done over generations. But what happened was, it used to be the most sacred thing, at least for mothers. Fathers fell off the wagon longer before that, but for mothers upheld, and grandmothers, the sacred honor and duty of raising children, especially in the first and formative years, being the primary person, the mother. And there's things in this world that only mothers and grandmothers can do. As a matter of fact, there is no other person as significant as the mother, especially in the first years of the child. It just isn't. Biology already dictates that. There's no other way. And any supplement for that is not a supplement. It's not a worthy supplement. It only gets worse from there. Now, men and women were led away from the family values first by breaking the multi-generational bond. That was the first thing that happened. It used to be quite normal for families to live in multi-generational communities, if you will. Maybe they didn't live in the same house. In most European countries, that was a custom, and to a certain extent still is, but they were at least living close together. And so the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, sort of, was really true, where you had the primary people, the mother and the father. The parents are naturally the primary people, but then you had, brothers, sisters, and grandmothers and grandfathers and uncles and aunties. And so you had a system, a support system to raise that child, a system that was, it shared values. It usually shared a belief system. It shared a cultural background. So you were ensuring that your child was raised in a manner and way that you thought was right. So then the first thing that happened was that multi-generational chain was broken apart systematically by incentivizing other things, by incentivizing people to move away from each other, by creating a sort of opportunities. And you said, well, it doesn't matter if you have to move 500 or 1,000 miles away, but there's an opportunity. You'll do better in your career, you'll make more money and whatnot. So all these things were amplified. Family values, community values were brought down on the ladder. And then when that was accomplished, the next thing that, they went after was the nuclear family unit, mother, father, children. And then they started making it more and more difficult for a family to live on the income of the father, right? So it became more and more difficult to live on that. At the same time, they were incentivizing and they were pushing for women to enter the workforce more and more, and in earlier and earlier, and to seek fulfillment through careers. Now, I'm not trying to pass blame here or point fingers, but when you begin seeding these ideas already in the education system that being, or when you have a child, that being a mother is not really as important, that there are other things that are more important. This was put slowly but surely into the psyche of women. And so they were actually robbed of this most sacred and beautiful thing. And of course, fathers too, by pushing them so hard on career paths and making it so important, and where the status in society, was solely connected to what they did for a living, what careers they had. Because after the first formative few years, it is very important, and even in the beginning, but more so after the first few years, for the father to become very, very tightly involved. As I said, biologically in the beginning, there's not much for a father to do in the beginning. Naturally, fathers are present. Naturally, fathers are there. But biologically speaking, it's really the nursing of the mother that plays the biggest role. And so these things were gradually pushed in society to the point where we are now we're past the point of, having children naturally and having a family unit, sort of the biological, I won't call it traditional, it's just the biological, the only possible family unit that produces new life is a father and a mother. People can live any way they want, but that's the only way that new life is created in a natural way. And that, of course, now we're past that point where that is high up on the value ladder. But the step before that was to say, okay, have children, but we're going to give you the opportunity to put your infant, your baby, into the hands of some unknown person with childcare and infant care so you can go to work. And what they've been telling women and teaching them in their own formative years is it is more important for you to do a task somewhere in the work field than to be the most influential person in your child's life. This is not something that was a natural development. This had to be taught. Most women in past times wouldn't even dream of giving up their children to a stranger, especially in those first years. Not because they didn't see children as a burden or in the way of their own fulfillment. They found fulfillment in being mothers. Today, this is not honored or valued, and it is sort of, oh, so you're just a stay-at-home mom. I always thought that these expressions are so condescending and disrespectful, because look at it from the most truest point of view. Mothers, when they have the chance, we're going to get to that. When mothers have the chance to be mothers today, they're raising the society of tomorrow. They're raising tomorrow's leaders. They're raising tomorrow's communities. They're raising tomorrow's consciousness. Now, we have to really see that for what it is. And likewise, when fathers step in a little later, usually the influence of a father becomes more important, especially on boys. The same. Mothers and fathers are, through their children, literally creating the world of tomorrow. Literally, not symbolically speaking. And so when children are sent off to some childcare or kindergarten or school, preschool, very, very early on, today, driven by necessity, because a lot of families are even struggling on 2 working parents' incomes, then these children are being molded by the agendas and the thoughts and the visions of people you don't know. Because we hardly ever know really who the people are who are taking care of the children. But what we for sure don't know is who programmed them. What system did they go through? What were they influenced by? What were their formative years, 0 to 7, like? And so when we look at that in a logical way, then we can see how we got to where we are. Because a majority of children was primarily raised and educated in the formative years by the system, if you will. Some aspect of the system. The closer it is to government-sponsored education, the weirder it gets. There are some private facilities that are pretty good, but they will never, ever be able to substitute for the mothers and fathers. Then it goes on. So basically, for a lot of families, that means that from 0 or from 1-year-old or 2-year-olds up to high school and college, children spend most of their time with strangers. Let's be honest. How many of you know the teachers of your children, or used to know really, really well? How many know who wrote the program? The problem that we had is that we didn't understand this. However, those who created these systems and the educational system understood this perfectly. They studied human behavior, they studied the human psyche, they studied subconsciousness, and they understood that a child between 0 and 7, 0 and 8 is in a completely different brain state. It's a different frequency, literally. And so it's more like a dream-like state. You could almost say hypnotic state, and their minds soak up everything like sponges and consider it truth. There is no developed filtration system yet, which allows children to discern or distinguish right? So what they're told, and especially what they're repetitively told, and especially what they're repetitively shown, they will simply believe is truth. It is extremely hard to go later on and deprogram and relearn things. It's really, really hard to do that. It's possible, and we're all proof that it's possible. But it's a lot of work. And because you don't see all the programming, you simply have to live life. Then you have to observe yourself, see how you react, see what you lean towards or lean away from, and question everything, right? Because it is completely unnatural the way that these systems work today. The solution, really, and I'm not saying it is easy, but it is simple. Let's make that distinction. The solution is very simple, but it's not easy to do, especially in today's world. And that's why I'm saying I don't want to point fingers. I absolutely understand the dilemma that most parents are in, and that to a certain degree, Christine and I were in as well, of course. And we fought for that. We fought hard for that, to be the primary influence in our children's lives, and it wasn't easy. And as they were growing up, and we tried a lot of things, and we changed up a lot of things, and we made mistakes like everybody else. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding how we can move forward in a better way. The truth is, some of the most pressing problems and insanities and madness that we see right now could be solved in a very short period of time if a significant portion of society made some currently considered radical decisions. And what I mean by that is they would say, okay, we're not giving our children away. So as mothers and fathers, we are going to raise our children. We're going to educate our children, or we will find a suitable group, a homeschooling group. There's different, and we can get a little bit into the details of that, how to do that. We will find a suitable way so that we know exactly who has influence over our children, and we are really observing how that works and immediately reacting if something goes the wrong way. So that's one thing, is really saying, especially, most especially between the age of 0 and 7, or let's say even 0 to 10. The next thing is, and here's my suggestion, when our kids are very little, their screen time, and back then it was only TV because smartphones weren't around yet, their screen time was very limited. And it was just around the time where very strange commercials and whatnot were coming on. And so one day we just decided to throw the TV out, and that was it. There were no screens. I would suggest that, especially today, now this sounds radical, but I would suggest that especially today, I wouldn't give children access to any screens other than maybe, when you FaceTime your grandparents or a family member that lives further away, that would make sense. But other than that, I wouldn't give them any screens. None. There's no reason for that. There's no intrinsic value. Yeah, sure, you can find some educational program, but really, there's no particular reason to do that. There are many other reasons other than just the content. It is how the brain reacts to the color schemes of screens, to the fast-paced transitions even in educational programs, and how it disturbs and how it even hurts the brain of a developing child. So there's a lot of reasons why, especially today's screens and the way everything is produced, is not suitable for children. It's also subliminal frequencies in audios and in videos, messaging and whatnot. So honestly, that if we had small children, that's what we would do now. The other thing is absolutely limiting, excuse me to say it, but limiting and being very, it's, kind of having an eye on who they interact and play with. I'm sorry to say it, but we're not in a world anymore where it's okay and even safe to play with all other children. The hurting, the trauma, the multi-generational trauma, the indoctrination, and the medical influence has become so big that, to a certain extent, I wouldn't just randomly allow my children to play with anyone. I would pick nature, and that's what we did for our children. We raised them in as natural environment as possible. We didn't live in a city, very much on the outskirts, not even a suburb. It was pretty much in the country. They had access to fields and woods and streams and nature, right? And so for them, it was natural to pick a berry off a bush or a fruit off a tree. And so they made certain connections and they had certain experiences. I understand not all of these things are immediately possible for everybody, but we need to have a vision for a better way. But really, if you only imagine that you could bypass the educational system from 0 to 10, and that on a, let's say, 10% level of society, meaning 10% of children were pulled out of that system and homeschooled or group schooled or no schooled, and I'm going to get into that in a moment, we would see incredible changes, like worldwide monumental shifts. This is not an exaggeration. All over the place, homeschool children, and it is not even specifically connected to what educational program they have. If I just look at the larger group of homeschool children, if you want to go into testing, they almost always test better in everything, including social skills, including emotional intelligence, almost always. Of course, there's exceptions, don't get me wrong, but all the myths that children can't socialize if they're not in school, well, how did they socialize for millions of years before there were those public institutions? That children, can't solve conflicts or whatever. None of that is really true. And our eyes were really open many years ago when Christine and I visited. We were in Vancouver, British Columbia, up in Canada. Beautiful 10 days we spent there. And we walked into, well, surprise, I was into hats back then. I was always wearing hats. So we walked into this hat store. And the name of the owner, I can't remember, but we got to talking to the owner, and she was sort of an eclectic lady, different, definitely stood out. And so we had a conversation about children, and I don't even know how we got so deep, but she told us about her, I think 3 or 4 children that she had. And they had decided on a concept we later explored in depth. No schooling is what they called it. So basically, they didn't have an educational program for their children. And at that time when we talked about it, that was a radical concept for many people. We were very intrigued by it. So we asked and they were at those early, I believe in their early 20s at that point. And so she told us that interest was driving their children's education. So when they really got interested in something, then they started searching, looking, learning, asking, and then she provided everything they were looking for, or they provided. And she told us that one of her children, her son, I believe, didn't read until he was 12 years old or so. And this bothered a lot of people. It didn't bother her. She said he simply didn't need it until that point, but then he got interested in a subject, and I believe it was astrophysics. And so she said within a couple of weeks, he basically taught himself how to read. We didn't go into the details, but he got sort of all the help that he needed and taught himself how to read because he wanted to read about astrophysics and learn about it. Later, he decided that's what he was going to go into the field. And so he went to university and he had to do those tests if you didn't go through the educational system. And he aced them. He was much, much better at everything because he never had even developed a adversity to learning and didn't even consider learning a separate discipline. It was just a part of life, right? And it was the same. All of her children ended up going into highly specified fields and becoming very, very, I think, very, very successful in their fields. It's a very interesting conversation. Later on, for a previous organization that we led, we interviewed a guy called Andre Stern, a French man who also popularized the concept of no schooling with his child and was experimenting with it and had amazing results. And we got sort of into a community that was simply looking at education from a completely different standpoint. We later explored some very special schools, or a very, very special school in the depths of of Siberia that was amazing. And so when you start looking and when you start exploring, you will see that there's a whole world out there. Now, in the last, especially since 2020, we've seen a very, very positive movement away from public schools to pod schooling, is what they call it, is like when parents get together and they hire a teacher of their choice that teaches a certain group of children. One of the things that seemed to be very unimportant compared to in the public system is that children need to be very close to the same age. It doesn't seem to be very important. You could mix children that are years apart and they develop concepts on how to transfer knowledge. The truth is that we are healing, then we're deprogramming, then we are relearning, unlearning and relearning and all those things. And this is a painful and it's a process that takes a very long time for adults to do. And we're willing to do it because that's what it takes. But we should give the next generation the chance to not have to go through that and start out and remain whole. And this is another aspect that I haven't even touched on, which is how through this idea that we give children away, that we put them in institutions and away from home, unfortunately, we allow for systemic abuse that is in place. Naturally, it does happen in the family a lot. Don't get me wrong, I understand that. But there is a systemic abuse system. And again, this is a hard pill to swallow, but abuse doesn't just happen because of created opportunities. There's a systemic approach to get to the child when they're as young as possible and have and abuse them, whether that is by extreme physical punishment or sexually abuse them. Because when you get and create that trauma very early on, you mold the person into a very specific being that is easy to manipulate and that will react to certain triggers when they're an adult. So all of these things are part, whether they're more hidden or whether they're more on the surface, but they're all baked into this current system. And so one of the prime things that we need to do, one of the most important things that we need to do together is think about these next generations. Also think about as parents is, I don't believe, and this happens, of course, but I don't believe that children were meant to be accidents, right? So I think there was a more conscious process that was supposed to be involved in it. Also in terms of what kind of environment am I providing for my child? Will I be able to be there? Are we in a position where that can happen? I think these are important questions and they shouldn't be overlooked. I think the more that we prepare the field that we bring our children into, the better it will be. And, extreme material wealth isn't what's most important. Naturally, you need some material wealth to make that happen, but it isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is actually time and dedicated attention, right? It's interesting that indigenous cultures look at the industrialized societies and quote unquote civilization. They always think it's very weird that women are taught to put their children away from them, keep them away in separate rooms, especially in the very beginning, right? When they carry their children with them and have that body-to-body connection. There's a reason for that, right? Especially in those first few months. There are so many natural things that we need to bring back to the equation, but the most important thing is consider if you're having young children, if you have young children or you plan on having children, consider where they will spend their first 10 years, who they will spend it with, and who will they spend most time with. If your child's in school 8 hours a day, that means they spend most time away from you, right? Because they sleep during the night, the 8 hours between 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. So that leaves about what, 4 or 5 hours, and then you have some chores and some homework and whatnot. That leaves very little time for direct connection. So they're going to be literally raised. They're going to become more like who's ever care they're in than you, or what you want them to be. And these are conversations that hopefully, especially elders, grandparents, great-grandparents can have without sort of trying to take over, but just saying, consider this. And have you looked into the importance of the first 7 to 10 years of a child's life? Have you looked into how their psyche works, how their subconscious works, how their programming works? If I look at the current programs that are running through the public system and preschool systems, and story time with drag queens and gender ideology and such a confusion and brainwashing, not for a day I would leave my child there. It's complete insanity. And the reason why it is insanity is because the people that are currently facilitating this kind of education, they themselves were programmed in certain ways in their formative years. So this is what multi-generational programming, indoctrination, and trauma create. And we have seen this. There was we had a live stream not too long ago, a show on Yuri Bezmenov, who was the KGB defector who came from the Soviet Union in the 70s to North America. There's this famous interview when he was interviewed by G. Edward Griffin, where he talks about these things and how this didn't happen by accident. Everybody who understands how this works, every regime, every government, everyone who wants to have influence goes after the children. Because when you mold the child, you create the man. That's how it is. And so this is one of the most important subjects. And again, I do not want, and this is very important to me, I don't want to point fingers or blame anybody, because I know most everybody does the best they can with what they have. But when we move forward, we can make new decisions. The best and easiest way, if you will, is definitely community. There's a lot of things that's difficult financially and in other ways for families to do simply on their own. But if you even unite 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 families on this path, and if you can get on the same page, hire a teacher, find someone, or one of the parents, or they rotate, there's many ways that things can change significantly. Laws are very, that's another aspect, of course. There are some nations that make it extremely hard, or they will send the weight of the government after you. But in most nations, there's a way. You just have to find it, right? Even within this current system, there's a way to do it. You just have to find it. I can't speak for every nation. I know it's pretty easy in the United States. Most states, pretty easy. In most European countries, people think that there is an obligation to go to school when really the law, the legal system just prescribes education. It doesn't say it has to be in a school. I believe France has changed that. They require kids to go to school, and this is a problem in and of itself. You have to think about it. How can someone tell you that you do need to send your child to a certain building at certain times, or else it'll be taken away? That is craziness, right? But this is a field that is very close to our hearts, and because we did it differently, and because we are and were connected to many parents who did it differently, we just saw some amazing results. These children are usually much more confident. They're much more connected, logical thinking, emotional intelligence, social skills, and whatever they usually put their mind to when they go and pick a profession, something they want to do, they do very well. There's just maybe at a future time, we will have sort of localized school systems that will work again, or that will actually provide valuable education, wholesome education, and remain and allow for the child to remain intact spiritually and on all levels and keep their creativity and keep their uniqueness. But for right now, there's very little of that or none of that. You can find some in the private sector, but be careful. Honestly, I mean, what would be more valuable than what goes into your child's mind? Think about it. What could possibly be more valuable? And what could be more significant? If you think college is all that significant, 0 to 7, maybe 0 to 10, that's when the person is molded. All right, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for being with us again today on Rumble, X, YouTube. We love you. We appreciate you. We'll be back with you again very, very soon.